Many thanks for inviting me to the conference, and I'm sorry that I can't be there today. I'm sure it'll be a great event. Thanks also to Sarah and Catherine for accommodating me in this way. Visits to country houses are often divided between staring in wonder at the riches of the owners and empathising with the daily grind of work as a servant, whose lives often seem more real and authentic. We see the splendours of the drawing room and the ovens and work tables of the kitchen. Lives of leisure are juxtaposed with lives of work, yet both, I think, are partial pictures. On the one hand, we all too seldom see the rooms in which servants lived or slept, in part because these have either been converted into offices or incorporated into the shop or the tea room, but also because there remains surprisingly little historical research on these spaces, especially for the 18th century. On the other hand, the work and the busyness of owners is glimpsed only occasionally, maybe in a monument room or a study, or in the handicrafts produced by the ladies of the house. My paper tries to offer corrective to this by exploring first the living spaces of servants and then by looking at the working life of a country house owner. Both of these, of course, are necessarily dealt with very briefly. For the living spaces of the servants, I take Stoneleigh Abbey as my example. The usual picture that we have of this house is the grandiose West Range, built in the 1720s. But I want to focus on a group of rooms in the older part of the house, redeveloped from the original Abbey buildings. To do this, I draw on a series of inventories that detail the contents of every room, including those occupied by servants. This is a familiar source then, but not one that is often used to examine these parts of the country house. Christopher Gilbert's 1977 exhibition at Temple Newsome is, I think, a rare exception. It's difficult to briefly summarise all of the changes across a period of 80 years, and I therefore focus on two sets of rooms, those belonging to the steward and those occupied by the maids and the coachman. So, what do these inventories tell us about the changing nature of servants' rooms? Overall, we can see some improvement, but this was much more marked for senior servants. If we simply count up the number of items in the room, then we can see that the steward's rooms became much fuller. There were 25 items in 1738, 44 in 1774, and 61 by 1806. The maids and the coachman experienced much less change, with an additional chair, table, or looking glass being about it in quantitative terms. Moreover, the range of furniture for these lesser servants was fairly stable: beds, chairs, tables, perhaps a looking glass or a chest. The steward fared better, and by 1774 there was a desk, a weather glass, a dressing table, a chest of drawers, amongst various other things. His material culture became richer and more diverse, partly as his rooms were colonised by pieces removed from other parts of the house. A gilt-framed sconce, a walnut table and chairs, and a library desk were hardly bought for his rooms. Quality can be more difficult to determine from inventories, but one thing that stands out is the disappearance from the inventories of descriptions of goods as old. In the 1738 inventory, there were old blankets, old bedsteads, old feather beds, old curtains, and so forth. These were swept away in a general refurbishment of the house undertaken when Edward V Baron Lee inherited the property in 1763. Thereafter, things are described purely in terms of their material or style. This general improvement in quality also involved growing comfort, especially for the steward. He had a fire and sconces in his rooms by 1738, a close stool by 1749, and window curtains, which matched the bed furniture, and carpets as well, by 1774. In this, his living space paralleled more general improvements in comfort seen across country houses. The maids and the coachman were not quite so lucky. Some had fireplaces by 1749, but these were far from ubiquitous. There's no mention of lighting in their rooms, and only an occasional looking glass. Some had carpets, but there were no curtains listed. There was, it seems, a growing divide between senior and other servants in terms of the comfort of their rooms. However, there was also a minimum provision which all enjoyed, one that might be quite surprising. All rooms had feather beds, pillows and bolsters, and all had a fairly standard set of 3 blankets and some form of coverlet or quilt. Everyone, it seems, could enjoy sleep at least reasonably comfortable. Added to this, all rooms contained chairs and tables, which suggests that servants had the opportunity to sit, perhaps in company with others. Certainly, there are more chairs than beds in each room, and there's little to suggest that the latter were shared. The maid's garret even contained an easy chair by 1806, perhaps a place to sit and relax, especially as there's also a bath stove in the room by that date, although how often it was lit remains uncertain. The possibility for sociable interaction, however, was much greater in the steward's room. He had a variety of chairs and tables, which could accommodate a range of activities, including eating and playing games. Indeed, the 1786 inventory includes a draught board and men. Add to this things like his plate warmer and his coal box, and his rooms take on a homely air. It was also, it seems, a fairly private space, with places for secure storage, a bureau and several chests, for example. In contrast, the maids had little such provision, not even the lockable box, which Amanda Vickery views as the basic level of privacy. That said, such items may have been viewed as personal possessions, and hence were omitted from household inventories. Overall then, even a cursory analysis of inventories such as I've presented here can reveal much about the servants' living spaces. The hierarchical differences are no surprise, but the level of comfort enjoyed by senior servants and their receipt of furniture moved from elsewhere in the house is perhaps more striking. The sparseness of the maids' rooms again fits our picture of servants' lives, but the provision of good bedding and the presence of fires reminds us that they too enjoy some domestic comfort. In the second part of the paper, I wanted to turn to the working lives of country house owners. Whilst arguably defined by their lack of need to work for their living, many landowners were active and busy in economic, political and social undertakings. My focus here is on one individual, Sir Roger Newdigate. This is not so much because I see him as being typical of country house owners. Indeed, what would such a person look like, I wonder? But more because he illustrates the wide range of work undertaken by such people. Roger Newdigate had a very obvious working life as an MP, briefly for Middlesex and then for about 30 years for Oxford University. He was a very active MP, attending the House regularly through the parliamentary season, during which time he lived at his London house close to Whitehall. He also did much to support the university, giving money to secure the transfer of the Arundel marbles to the museum and working to improve the fabric of his alma mater, University College, as well as defending the rights and privileges of the university as a whole. All this took time as well as money. But back home in Warwickshire, Newdigate was also an active JP and an officer in the militia. His voluminous correspondence, and it really is voluminous, includes letters about the bread assizes and about his work with the Nuneaton branch of the militia. The latter included working to secure the provision of supplies for manufacturers in Birmingham and organising the recruitment and enrolment of volunteers, as we can see from this quote. He also wrote to his wife Sophia, relating details of life at the camp near Plymouth, to which the regiment was sent in 1762. The duties were not terribly onerous, and he found time to visit nearby houses. But this was work nonetheless, and it took him away from his home and away from his family. Despite these absences and his political life, Newdigate was also closely involved in the running of his Warwickshire estates. He actively promoted the Coventry Canal and developed the coalfields on his land around Nuneaton, which considerably enhanced estate income from the 1780s. More striking in many ways was the minute attention to detail that characterised his estate management. There are about 60 years of account books kept in a meticulous detail in his own hand, as is shown in this illustration. He carefully audited the accounts of his housekeepers, occasionally deducting small amounts from the sum that was owed to them. He also wrote frequent and detailed letters to his steward, checking that work had been carried out and giving instructions for work to be undertaken, again, as this quote shows us. His spare time, if that's the right word, his spare time was taken up by a wide range of scholarly interests. He undertook 2 continental tours and numerous others of England and Wales. This was by no means unusual for English landowners, of course, but he spent an enormous amount of time inspecting, measuring and drawing many of the buildings that he saw on these trips, including, amongst others, parts of the Palatine in Rome and the alignments of the stones at Stonehenge. His particular interest, though, was in the Gothic, and he was a notable early exponent, progressively Gothicising his house in Warwickshire, but also sketching Gothic features when he saw them on his travels. In this respect, he followed the tradition of gentleman architects. He drew designs for his house and its contents, often taking inspiration from the monuments that he'd seen and sketched in churches, here, for example, at Bristol. There are surviving designs for chairs, as we can see here, and his correspondence with stove makers in London makes clear that the design for these new fireplaces were his own work. Overall then, Sir Roger Newdigate was extremely busy. Whether we view this as work is a matter of perspective, or perhaps a matter of definition. I think if we are to properly comprehend the lives of country house owners, we need to broaden our view of work beyond narrow conceptions of paid employment to encompass a much wider range of activities, such as those being undertaken by Sir Roger Newdigate. So, to briefly conclude, what I've tried to do here is to open up new ways of viewing the country house by reversing the usual dichotomy of working and living. My focus on the living spaces of servants builds on well-established approaches to the social life of the country house, but extends this into the servants' bedchambers and parlours. These are sometimes lost from houses today, but they can be reconstructed through historical analysis and creative interpretation. They can thus be used to recount untold stories. And in terms of the owners, we need to recognise that they often led busy and active lives that went beyond collecting art, creating beautiful buildings and socialising with their peers, important perhaps though these activities may have been. They too worked, although it was in very different ways from the ways in which their servants experienced work, in supplying the daily needs of their employers. So this involves reconceiving work, but also being willing to complicate the stories that we tell about the country house, both as historians and curators. Thank you.